complicated, you know, man. It's like a dang old Rubik's Cube, man. You like talking about that blue, red, man, then you get to one side and it's like messed up.
All right, George Bagby, welcome back to the show. How are you doing?
Great. It's good to be back.
And I'm glad to have you. So tonight we're here to discuss a book that's been incredibly influential to both you and I in real life, and also is the source of my pseudonym. So we're here tonight to discuss All the King's Men by Robert Penn Warren. So if you could you give us kind of a basic thumbnail sketch of the plot?
Definitely. This book gets pegged often as the fictionalization of the reign of Huey P. Long in Louisiana, and that's not a bad characterization. Robert Penn Warren liked to push back against that characterization. He liked to say that his characters stand alone, but he admits that he was directly inspired by the Long administration and especially by Huey Long's mysterious assassination, which ended his life. Assassination down here in Louisiana that don't accept the official story of that assassination. But the real hero of the piece is Jack Burden, who is the main character. He's the protagonist. And Jack Burden is a newspaper reporter, educated at LSU. He was previously a history graduate student. And he starts out as a skeptic, a jaded sort of cure for himself by reporting on the campaign of an upstart country politician named Willie Stark, a man who gets his start by exposing corruption at the local governor. Jack Burden covers his campaign and sees him into the governor's mansion, and then is invited to join the Stark organization as a researcher. In that role, he's sent out to dig up dirt on the governor's opponents. So at this point, I'm gonna reveal the big twist in the plot and give the big spoilers. It turns out that the governor's main opponents are Jack Burden's unknown father. Jack Burden thinks that he knows who his father is. It turns out the man that he thinks is his father is not actually his father. And he ends up blackmailing his own father and causing his own father to commit suicide, all at the behest of Governor Stark, to destroy the credibility of the governor's opponents. In the process of this, Burden goes through a transformation in a really amazing way. This is the redemptive arc of the novel. Burden goes from a thoroughgoing materialist skeptic to a believer in God once again. And this transformation is made through the suffering of Burden and also the characters that he most cares about. So the novel is particularly modern, but it is also refreshingly ancient in its plot and its devices to work out this spiritual suffering and redemption finally in the end. And it's for that reason, also the fact that it's the novel of my hometown, Baton Rouge, Louisiana, where it is set in large part. It's a great novel of my native state. It's a novel full of Louisiana characters. It's a novel that draws on Louisiana history. It's a particularly regional novel, one of the great Southern novels. It won the Pulitzer Prize in the 40s. And it's one that has always spoken to me in a powerful way. I've always appreciated this book. We were talking just before the stream started. Neither of us are sure just how many times we've read this novel at this point. This is one that's very close to me.
So obviously I'll echo everything you've said on it. For a little bit of, I guess, personal background on when I read the book. If I'm not mistaken, I think I started reading it the summer after I graduated from high school, and then I believe I finished it my freshman year of college. And Warren's prose is great. You have a few segments on your YouTube channel where you describe or where you read passages from All the King's Men, and his prose is beyond masterful. And there's one section which I believe you have, on your channel, where it's essentially the opener to the book, where it describes, our main characters kind of whizzing along the Louisiana highways in a fast car. And that's one of those things where it always just, sends shivers down my spine every time I listen to it. And I get it. Look, that's an emotional reaction to it, but it's a powerfully written book. And it's not only just a beautiful read in the sense that the actual construction of it is well done. He's a master, but also, at least personally, I feel a certain amount of resonance to the character of, Jack Burden. And much like you said, he starts off this book as an incredibly just cynical, kind of jaded character. He's had this career as kind of a political hatchet man, kind of doing a lot of, dirty work, opposition research for, this kind of like charismatic Louisiana politician. And over the course of it, and not necessarily kind of smoothly either, we see this character essentially make peace with his roots. Obviously, this is both a spoiler and not a spoiler, because it's not necessarily the most dramatic event in the book. But the ending of it essentially involves, our main character, making peace with his father, making peace with his home, returning to his ancestral home and marrying essentially his high school sweetheart who he kind of walked out on in an earlier date in life. And that kind of like returning home, even within kind of like the broader tragic narrative of Willie Stark, I find incredibly, I guess, intoxicating. Do you see what I'm getting at there?
Absolutely. This is one of the aspects of it that makes it particularly Southern. It seems to me, it's the relationship to home and its characteristic American responses to heritage, to ancestry, to the baggage that our people left us. At the beginning of the novel, Burden is trying to escape it. And ironically, in trying to escape it, he is always overwhelmed by it. He's always dwelling on it. He's not at peace with his mother, for instance. His mother is kind of domineering. His mother is overly involved in his life and not adult
Edible?
life. And kind of disappointed in him that he's doing something as a single man, in his late 20s or something. He's not really interested in marrying and settling down or having a steady job. And his mother is always suggesting things to him. But he is always trying to avoid his mother, but he's always thinking about her. She pops up all the time just in his stream of consciousness. And he is dominated by her in this unhealthy way because he dislikes her strongly. He does not understand her. Similarly, he's always drawn back to his boyhood home, but he doesn't like it. He's trying to escape it by going to the big city and seeking after fame by getting his name in print. And yet he cannot escape his home. He cannot get past it. He's always drawn back to it, kind of outside of his inclinations and intentions. But it's later in the novel when he's actually able to make peace with his home and make peace with his family, even after he's done his family tremendous harm, that he finds peace for the first time for himself. And he is not, I guess he's not dragged down by those connections. Those connections at home are constructive for him, finally, in the end. He finds a healthy attitude towards them. And that's one of the aspects of the novel that I'm always coming back to. The novel is very interested in our connection to our ancestors, our connection to our home places. And that's an aspect of it that is particularly Southern. Those themes come up in Southern literature very consistently. What is the healthy attitude?
And there's a long section in this book that in my mind kind of divides it into two parts, in which we kind of hear a recounting of our, if I remember this correctly, of our main character at college, correct?
Yes.
And then in this, he kind of describes the people he meets at college, which I think that you and I have both met people who fit the description of his roommates to a T.
Absolutely.
But also that he essentially is kind of floundering for a thesis, something to kind of complete his degree with. And so he finds a kind of an account of an ancestor of his, correct? They are related, I believe, distantly.
That's right. Yeah, he's a direct descendant of a Civil War officer, a Southerner, of course.
And when he digs into this man's life, he essentially finds this tale of like sordid scandal. And it could almost be read, in and of itself, but through this kind of we see this pattern of, what we call it in kind of the theological sense of like generational sin. The idea that kind of not only are our actions harmful, to ourselves, right? They're morally incorrect actions, but they are, our progeny, because there's a theme throughout of, of kind of parentage and of, lineage, is probably a better way to say it. Multiple characters and the way that they relate to their fathers, the way that they relate to their family, and the way that someone's lineage kind of continues or fails to continue, through their children.
Right.
And there's a really, I guess, complicated understanding of that in this book that I think is almost kind of like unparalleled. Do you see what I'm kind of stumbling around?
Yeah, it is grasping after ancestral connections to one's own male ancestors. And you're quite right. Warren is playing up this theme that weaknesses are communicated from generation to generation. But there's another aspect to it that comes out, I think, towards the end, after the cathartic suffering of Jack Burden, where he sees some of the strengths of his ancestors, where previously he only saw their weaknesses. We see that especially, I think, in the character of Anne Stanton, which is Jack's love interest, the girl that he first loved, and the girl that he is finally with in the end. He's restored to her in the end. She is also obsessed with her ancestors, but in another unhealthy way. This is something really great about the book, because Robert Penn Warren is not just going to browbeat us with characters that dislike their own ancestors. he gives us an example of someone with an unhealthy regard for her own ancestry. Anne Stanton is portrayed as worshiping her dead father, holding him in an unhealthy regard. And in the course of the novel, her regard for her father is destroyed by information about a scandal. She and her brother both face a serious moral crisis when their picture of that they had of their father is destroyed in their imagination, or in their fantasy, I should say. When they get knowledge that their father was involved in a scandal and was morally culpable, even though it is understandable, their father did not himself do something wrong. Instead, he covered for his friend who had done something wrong, and did not sacrifice his friend in a misplaced sense of loyalty, perhaps, being that Anne Stanton's father was the governor of Louisiana. He covered for his friend who had done something wrong, who had done something evil. His friend was Jack Burden's father, Judge Irwin. That was the fault. That was the scandal. He hid his friend's wrongdoing. And when Anne Stanton and Adam Stanton find out about that, they rethink the standards of their lives. And they themselves compromise on high moral standards themselves. Anne Stanton starts an affair with Governor Stark. Adam Stanton compromises with Governor Stark and agrees to lead the new hospital program that Governor Stark is founding. Previously, he had refused to have anything to do with it out of a sense of moral purity, let's say. So Anne and Adam have this inflated notion about their ancestors. And when that notion is first challenged, they lose their own sense of identity. It destroys them both in some way. It damages Anne, and it ends up destroying Adam entirely. He ends up dying, kind of as a result of that.
So to me,
worshiping our ancestors and hating our ancestors are both faults. We should not do either of those things, and that is one of the stories in the novel. That's one of the myths in the novel.
To me, it almost feels like it was kind of written to us and our friends, because we're very much surrounded by a culture that despises our ancestors, right? You see this very cleanly in the modern German. So I've been reading more Paul Gottfried books about anti-fascism, as I've said a few times in the last couple episodes. But both in that book and also in my dealings with kind of like modern Germans, you see the true pathology of kind of like hating and feeling this need to consistently like denigrate and erase your ancestors. That's obviously, we see that as being kind of like, I guess, destructive and evil. But I think that much like the Stantons, there is this kind of risk to be had in over idealizing your forefathers. And I think really you see this in kind of like on one hand, there's kind of like the race worship, the ancestor worship that you see on some parts of our movement, but also I think in the kind of baby boomer constitution worship, where essentially the founding fathers were, modern day saints, kind of the aging civic religion of our grandparents. And obviously you need a healthy respect for your ancestors. And, very much that we, in the end of this book, we see, our main characters kind of come to peace with their forefathers as men, kind of both evil and good, aspects of their personalities. And to me, I feel like there's kind of a cautionary tale, especially in the way that the Stantons relate to their father. because being more traditionally minded and being more patriotically minded, we are kind of predisposed towards, kind of a idolatry of our ancestors.
Certainly so. I certainly feel that. I want to counteract the mindless hate that I hear constantly directed towards anyone with old-fashioned views, any old person, anyone involved in certain things in my own country's history, or anyone past a certain point of history. And I want to give their side of things. That's part of what I do as a history teacher. I'm there to explain what people believed and to make them relatable. But I know that I'm always tempted to overcompensate and to practice hagiography instead of giving nuanced views. And I am always aware of that. I want to give complete pictures and point out that none of them in these conflicts have up-to-date opinions by our standards. None of them believe what people now believe about controversial topics. They're coming from their own place, and we have to appreciate them for the standards of their time, rather than some anachronistic standard, as modern people are so tempted to do these days. But I agree with you. That's one of the cautionary tales of the novel, that we can't worship our ancestors. Worshipping our ancestors destroys them and destroys us. The healthy alternative, it's not to hate, not to flee, not to reject. In hating our parents, for instance, we're constantly thinking about our parents. Those that hate their parents, those that hate their ancestors by extension, are consumed with thinking of them all the time. In some ways, they are more captives of their past than someone with a healthy attitude. But the novel, it shows us, the hatred is a kind of captivity and an unhealthiness. And the worship is also a captivity, an unhealthiness, and both of them lead to destruction. Neither of them sets us free to be individuals. And at the end of the novel, we see through tragedy, through a Greek sense of tragedy, the suffering that results from those hubristic beliefs. All the King's Men is a tragedy in a classical sense, in a Greek sense. Warren certainly wanted us to know that about the book. It even had a previous form, a form that I don't know if any of it actually survives, but Warren does mention it several times. He originally composed it as a Greek-style drama, even with a chorus that speaks in verse from time to time. It started out as a play and then turned into a novel. There's a curious aspect to it.
No, that is, and it is like many Southern writers in particular, like Faulkner's dripping in this, and Flannery O'Connor's dripping in this. There is kind of that sense of, I guess, deep attachment to, I guess, the kind of like Western canon, throughout. I during the discussion on, which we have at this point beaten to death, and so I only mean to mention it in passing, kind of the American question, the dialogue a month or so back. To me, at least, the contention that there was, no such thing as American culture is perhaps most absurd when you look at, the literary field. Obviously, I would make the argument that film is the definitive American, media. But, Americans have, especially in kind of the modern era, have a whole crop of incredibly prolific, I guess, like writers and poets and there's a lot to be mined from that. So if you could you offer some type of, I guess, like introduction and summary to the man Robert Penn Warren?
Yes, he's a literary giant of his time. He started out as a member of a group of poets in Nashville, Tennessee. He himself was from Kentucky, and he came down to Nashville for college. And he joined a group of poets that styled themselves as the fugitive poets. And that's where he began writing poetry. The fugitive poets had a publication that was called The Fugitive. And among them were people like Allen Tate and Donald Davidson, other great Southern writers and poets. Among them were several men that became academics. I suppose Warren taught at the university for most of his life, but he was best known as a novelist and poet. The fugitives ended up writing a famous book of essays called I'll Take My Stand in the 30s during the Depression. I'll Take My Stand is a very interesting volume in that it is a Southern agrarian perspective on federal reforms that are meant to industrialize the country. And it is a rejection of the industrial consumerist way of life. The agrarians, of which Warren was one of them, they all ascribe to an introductory statement in the volume and said that they prefer the agrarian way of life over the industrial way of life. And they held up the American South not as a cultural backwater, not as a blighted region that's outside of the mainstream, but as a region that is producing a great amount of high quality art and is culturally rich. They speak of the South's virtues, and they say they want to preserve those things. They even go as far as to make the argument that the South is culturally rich and artistically productive because it has not been industrialized. The people in it have not been alienated. Now, that's a really great theme when we jump ahead 20 years and Warren is writing All the King's Men and winning the Pulitzer Prize for it. It was the first Pulitzer Prize he won. He went on to win a Pulitzer for poetry and was named the Poet Laureate of the United States. I'm not sure who names those people. It's some governmental organization, but Warren was the first man to hold that title. These days, I don't think that his poetry... I'm no specialist on modernist American poetry. I don't know very much about Warren's poetry. I've mostly read his novel and his essays. He wrote several works of nonfiction, and that's where I know him best. He won the Pulitzer for, I believe it was his second novel, All the King's Men. He wrote a number of novels, and he went on to found a magazine while he taught at LSU. He founded the Southern Review while he taught at LSU. He became good friends with Cleanth Brooks and Robert Penn Warren. He was at least an acquaintance of Richard M. Weaver during his time at LSU. He personally observed Huey Long while he was at LSU and was even accused of being in cahoots somehow with Huey Long. People speculated that he was somehow in Long's pay or was being corrupted with money from Long or something. The truth is that Long just put some competent people in charge. That was one of his talents. He found good people for LSU and then gave them as many resources as he could possibly spare. And they did wonderful things with the resources. hence Cleanth Brooks and Robert Penn Warren. Robert Penn Warren and Cleanth Brooks also founded a school of literary criticism at LSU, which is called the New Criticism. They wrote textbooks for English instructors. Wonderful books, if you can find them. They're very difficult to find. I'm down here in Baton Rouge, so I have an easier time finding these things. But they wrote a book called Understanding Poetry, and they wrote another book called Understanding Literature. And in both of them, they outline the new critical school. They're basically saying their position is actually very mild. It's not a radical position. They're saying too many English teachers think they're teaching Shakespeare by giving a brief outline of Shakespeare's life and opinions and the dates in which he lived, when in fact they ought to be reading Shakespeare. They ought to just focus on what the man wrote. So that's Robert Penn Warren's New Criticism in a nutshell. It's not at all a radical position. New critics today might say, ignore the biography. The author has nothing to do with the text. That's a very radical position, and that's not the position Robert Penn Warren and Cleanth Brooks took. But Robert Penn Warren was also very interested in the civil rights movement and segregation in the South. Some say this is a leftover or a guilty feeling that he had after his essay in I'll Take My Stand. He wrote an essay in I'll Take My Stand entitled The Briar Patch, in which he offered a defense of Southern racial segregation in the 1930s. They say, his biographers say, that he spent most of the rest of his career backtracking on that. I think that is correct. I think he did backtrack on that. But along the way, he offered us a really incredible book. And this would be the other major work by Robert Penn Warren I would recommend. And that is a wonderful book called Who Speaks for the Negro? In that book, Robert Penn Warren went around in the early 60s and interviewed the who's who of Black political leaders, rabble-rousers, literary figures, and asked them all the same questions and recorded his interviews. So you can actually listen to him interviewing Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. And he asked them all the same questions, and they produce very interesting answers. And this is all about civil rights and segregation and things like that. And the point of the book is that no single Black leader in the 60s is speaking for the whole race, and they all have radically different ideas about just what they think is desirable. So that's one thing that you can just take away from that book by Penn Warren, and it makes it a very stimulating read. I highly recommend it.
One of the things that I've always kind of admired about, I guess, like Warren and his circles is that there's something about what it is to be American that is inherently contradictory. And I was even speaking to Thomas about this yesterday. There's actually a lot of that in this book. This kind of tension between, the pull Americans have, to the open road, to wander, to find our own kind of like patch of, undiscovered country. And then also this tie to, our ancestors, our home, where we're from. And one of the other kind of splendid contradictions in America is that, kind of the most backwater, the lowest GDP, the lowest, standard of living, if you consider those things to be, the proper metrics by which to judge a culture, sections of our country produces by far our best writers. And to me, that's always been kind of one of those I guess, kind of quirks of America that I've always enjoyed. That the fact that, and don't get me wrong, there are a great many writers from the Northeast, a great many, writers from California as well. But so many of our, our best and brightest are from the rural South. And I've always really enjoyed that. One of the other things that I think is interesting in an area that you can really glean some wisdom from this book is this is a political novel, not in the sense that he's trying to prove some grand political point, but the drama is a direct result of politics. So if you could, I guess, kind of describe some of the political lessons that can be pulled from this book. Do you have anything on the top of your head?
Yeah, we could just start at the beginning of it. We see at the start of the novel the framing of the characters.
Oh, Bagby, you dropped out for a little bit. Well, if he doesn't come back for a little bit, I can handle at least the point where he's going. So, like I said, the opening of this book starts with our characters essentially traveling along the highway, in an expensive car. The whole party is essentially going to Willie Stark's hometown. Willie Stark is the governor of an unnamed state that is essentially Louisiana, and he's going back to the low rent, rural town where he's from. And it opens with essentially him just wandering into town. And we know that this man is a celebrity. He's an absolute star of the political scene. Because we know that he has posters everywhere in town. There's one that's described as 6 times life size. And from this, we kind of learned a lesson that I guess we could have learned from watching Hillary Clinton. Sorry, Bagby, you dropped out up until just now. So I caught people up to the moment in which Willie is back at his hometown, kind of preparing to give a speech to the people he grew up with. So sorry, you dropped out for about 90 seconds, though. Are you still there, Bagby? Well, until he comes back. Oh dear, this is quite awkward now. Anyway, I hope that the Bagby comes back, because this would be better as a discussion than it would be as a monologue. But from that, we see that this man is kind of I don't want to say manipulator, but sort of a master manipulator, and that his political persona is essentially a different part of him. So the way that Burden describes, in kind of behind his eyes, the way that he sees Willie is that his almost a new person takes over him. Gone is kind of this, kind of like flabby, obviously, well-fed politician, and he becomes again this kind of like honest hometown, I guess, farm boy. And so we see very much that even in the way he transforms himself into the situation, he is fundamentally a political survivor and a political animal. So I guess that's kind of what the opener tells us. Bagby may be getting in a wider point, but if so, I can't hear it. To me, if you guys want to hear a kind of a summary of it, I would describe All the King's Men as a novelization of the populist delusion. Throughout, we see. Oh, you're back. Okay, you dropped out for a little bit, and I had to kind of vamp to make back up. Do you want to address the point that you brought up initially? Because I lost almost the whole thing.
I'm very sorry about that. You were saying that it concerns populism, and I think that is very much the theme. The governor character, Willie Stark is the character's name, is obviously modeled after Huey Long, and people frequently take the novel as the fictionalized version of the Huey Long story. Now, there are many differences involved, and Warren always wanted to stress he was kind of amused that people bought his novel and read and enjoyed his novel when they were actually looking for something about Huey Long, and he wanted them to know that this was not the place to go. If you wanted to find out about Huey Long, you needed to read biography. But Huey Long is this great American populist character, and he may be one of the best examples of a success in populism. He certainly is that in the historical memory of people here in Louisiana. He remains a very controversial figure, but Louisianians cannot deny that the man did an awful lot by disregarding the rules of the system. Willie Stark is doing that very frankly in this novel. Willie Stark gets his start in politics by exposing corruption at a local level that results in the schoolhouse being built with substandard bricks. What happens is a fire escape collapses and several children are maimed and killed as a result. And this catapults Willie Stark, the character in the novel, to prominence statewide. In the process of this, Stark is tempted by a big city politico to run for governor and is offered funding to do so. So Stark begins his political career by running for governor, kind of jumping from a minor functionary in local government to a race for the governor, and realizes along the way that he was set up to split the opposition to the big city candidate. So he was running to split the rural vote. And Stark is made wise to political realities. And rather than bow out of a sense of idealism, he decides to become a Machiavellian. And in doing so, he is ruthless with his enemies and seizes power and is not in the least concerned about the rules of the game in doing so. Kind of disregards the rules of the game and becomes an authoritarian figure with a populist mandate. So you could say it's a story of populism. You know, he is catapulted into power by promising the masses all sorts of handouts, you might say. But he gets the power and uses the power for particular ends and gets valuable things done in along the way. So I think it's a mixture of political realities. It's certainly a realistic political novel about backroom deals, about blackmail to get one's way in politics. All of these things were actually done during the Long administration, and that is one of the things that keeps him in our minds and still inspires us or horrifies us about the man today.
One of the other themes that I find in this, and your description of Stark's career, you know, is one version of this, but we see it multiple times, is this idea that you can't change the system changes you. So
Absolutely.
Obviously in the first instance, we see, Willie transform from kind of this kind of like wide-eyed, naive, young man who essentially believes that he can fix the corruption, and by writing a better speech, and by campaigning extra hard and going to the people, that he can do it. He can really succeed at it. And then there's another major character who, is present throughout it. There's kind of this eternal, cockroach-like character of Tiny Duffy, who is described as this kind of like corpulently disgusting, sweaty banker. And essentially this character is a political survivor. He's there before Willie. He offers Willie kind of his first hand up after his defeat. He's there through the entire book. And then after, when Stark is, eventually killed, he's still there. And not only does Willie kind of make this initial sacrifice of his kind of like naive morals, we see that, he knows that he's made these sacrifices, but he thinks it's all going to be, redeemed by the fact that he's building this hospital. We mentioned before, this kind of like big, beautiful hospital that will, essentially serve as a public service to reward the people who propelled him into.
And it will
success.
Outlast him.
Yes, it will be
knows
a legacy.
Be his legacy. It's going to be his kleos, right? His glory.
And being that it's a tragedy, and that it is very much I guess a rebuke of the populist delusion. We see that this dream, all of the sacrifices he made in order to secure his glory, essentially removed any possibility of him actually having it. Not only do we see this happen in in Willie Stark's case, but also, Adam Stanton and, essentially extremely moralistic, a very kind of like principled brother who is a world-class doctor. And understandably, because of the disgrace brought on his family, he hates Willie Stark and refuses to work with him until essentially, again, like as you've said, through this kind of disillusion, he agrees to essentially, make a deal to work within the system. The idea that like, well, what, if I just, stick to my principles within the system, it will all work out. And in all of these cases, we see that whatever the system is, the house always wins, to use a cliche. And I think that there is very much a kind of a literary rebuke of populism in this book.
Yeah, because the system corrupts everyone who is absorbed by it. I'm thinking of all the major characters, and they are the winners, right? Sadie Burke, Adam Stanton, Willie Stark, all of them that seek after the power, court the levers of power. They do get various things that they want, but it takes more out of them than they get in return. It ends up destroying most of these characters.
And I think that there's a truth in that. And look, I understand I've personally gotten a lot from, the elite theorists, and I have, I am fully convinced by many of their arguments. But the idea that, kind of the power and, creating an exception is something that doesn't damage you, I think is really naive. Obviously, kind of like the libertarian and the liberal conception of power is a limited one. It's one that's designed to make you lose. But on the other end, this kind of like converse position that I'm not really sure anyone holds, but, people do seem to kind of espouse that, like, well, if we just grab power, I'm going to be the one who wields it for good. And fair enough, like someone needs to do it. But it is a corrosive thing, especially on kind of the, at the individual level. And I don't mean to come off as, an overly soft or idealistic person in this, but I think that there is also a, kind of a cautionary tale, both against the kind of naive populism of, oh, we'll just vote in the guy and he'll fix it all. But also the idea that you can hold power without fundamentally changing who you are.
Well, it's one of the great things about the novel is that you can read it in several ways. So you could read it with Willie Stark as the main character. And that incidentally is my problem with the movie versions of the novel, is they sideline Jack Burden in some way or the other, when Jack Burden is obviously the main character. I will contend the point. I know the novel well. I mean, it is from Burden's perspective, and his character arc is the meaningful one in the novel, or the predominant one. But you could read it as a tragic story about Willie Stark. And in the end, Stark himself is destroyed. I think the novel does tell a tragic story about Willie Stark. Kind of like Julius Caesar tells a tragic story about Caesar, and it tells a tragic story about Brutus. But which of the two should you pay attention to? Brutus is around for the final act. Caesar is gone very early. Similarly, I would argue that All the King's Men. Let's pay attention to Jack Burden primarily, but what does Willie Stark sacrifice in order to get things done in Louisiana? He sacrifices being a husband. He sacrifices being a father. His religious convictions, such as they are, they're reduced to rhetoric in his speeches. It's not something that he actually embodies in his life anymore. He does actually do things. And I think he trades the other goods of life. I think he trades being a husband, being a father, being a man with real convictions in something beyond him, beyond himself, convictions in truth, convictions in God, convictions of integrity, traditional ideas about character. He sacrifices those things. And that is one of the magnificent things about the novel, is you see those points on which Willie Stark sacrificed the values that he formerly held for the sake of power, for the sake of getting things done in politics. He starts an affair with a fixer named Sadie Burke, and her expertise makes him governor. He maintains a relationship with his wife for the sake of appearances. He moves her out into the country. He spoils and indulges his son rather than discipline him. He wants his son to be a star football player, and his son does become a star football player, but his son is spoiled and it destroys himself in the end. His son does die. And of course, Willie Stark does have a long list of accomplishments by the end of his life, but he is also murdered through the evil choices that he made. The choices that he made come back and haunt him and inspire his enemy to kill him in the end. So it makes me think of Homer, and it's kind of coincidental. I was reading this part of the Iliad today to my students. At the end of the Iliad, Hector realizes that he's alone to face Achilles in their final duel together. Hector thought that his brother was standing beside him, but Pallas Athena tricked him. And rather than turn and run at the last, Hector resolves that he will stand, he will receive Achilles' blow. Hector has just shot his javelin and missed. And he says, now I will do something great that future generations will remember me by. And if necessary, I will die. And of course, that's exactly what happens. Achilles throws another spear and mortally wounds Hector, and Hector does die there. But Hector in that scene shows us that Greek value of kleos, of glory, immortal fame that survives death. People will remember. And strangely, that is a real legacy of these political actors that go in and unscrupulously seize power, manipulating their enemies, doing things that couldn't otherwise be done without this very high-handed and authoritarian tactic. Say what you want about Huey Long, people still care about him. What other politician from evokes such passionate opinion, loyalty, and conversation? Now, granted, you probably need to be in Louisiana for that, but I still would claim Huey Long is unique among American politicians for that reason. People care about him down here. Down here in Louisiana, people still talk about Huey Long. Go to a Louisiana diner and mention something related to Long, you'll find everyone has an opinion. And people are happy to talk about him. He's still inspiring, strangely enough. I know, just looking from the perspective of dead politicians, how many politicians would crave that sort of fame, generations after they have gone to rest? People still cross the bridges that Huey Long built today. Thousands of people cross them every day, and no one in Louisiana could imagine living in Louisiana without those things that Huey Long built that we're still using today. We're still getting mileage out of so long after his death. That's a really incredible legacy. And he was an unscrupulous guy. He was a ruthless guy. He was an immoral man. He was gross. He was vulgar. He was all of those things. He was very colorful. He's really very amusing. Lots of fun. And he's well portrayed in All the King's Men, fictionalized, if you will, in All the King's Men. But I don't know, does he gain the world and he loses his soul? It looks like that kind of story. Maybe effective politics isn't possible without that. No saint could long remain a politician. I'm reminded of Edward the Confessor, Saint Edward the Confessor, who was said to be indifferent to a man who was robbing him. A thief was caught in the king's chambers with a bag of gold, and Edward the Confessor let him go. Now, that's the action of a saint, to forgive your enemies, but it's not the action of an effective politician. You may remember the kingdom fell apart after Edward the Confessor. He was a sainted king. He is a saint. But maybe he wasn't the best ruler.
And I agree with everything you said there. Now we're coming up on time, and I don't mean to completely ambush you, but I have a little bit more to say. But while I'm doing that, do you think there's a passage you could find to read out from the book to kind of offer people a taste of the prose?
Absolutely, yes.
All right, and I can talk for a minute or two, kind of my concluding thoughts on it. I think for me, there's multiple ways of absorbing a lesson, and obviously the reading a nonfiction book is one way. Having a discussion about it is another, if you kind of like force it into your own, I guess, like way of understanding. But to me, absorbing something narratively is really like, if I can name kind of the important turning points in the way I thought of things. Many of them were concepts that I didn't necessarily get from nonfiction. I got it in a narrative form. And to me, so much of how I think about the world, of how I think about the way we relate to our past and our descendants is tied up in this book. In addition to that, it's also just very good art. And I think that if either you are American or you want to understand Americans more, this book is a great way to do it. It's not an obscure book by any means, but it's definitely not one that's read well enough. And I think that if you're interested in anything, I guess, like vaguely political or anything to do with American culture, I really can't recommend it enough. So I guess that's my final description of the book.
Well, I happened across the passage where Willie Stark is talking to Jack about his legacy, what he wants his legacy to be. Strangely enough, the reference here, what Penn Warren was thinking of, was Huey Long's foundation of the Charity Hospital, which is still an institution in Louisiana today, and it's something that people still care very much about. But this is the Willie Stark Medical Center that he's talking about. So in this scene, Jack and Willie are talking together at the governor's mansion, and Willie has had several drinks. So Willie is saying that he does not want his cronies to fix up a corrupt deal with a construction company for the hospital. He wants it all to be he wants the whole thing to be clean and straightforward. He does not want any corruption involved. So what do you expect? I asked. There's $6 million involved. Did you ever see the flies stay away from the churn at churning time? He better stay away from this churn. Well, he's just being logical. Obviously, Larson is ready to sell out McMurphy for a contract. He is a competent builder. He lunged up from his sitting position. He stared at me and demanded, "Are you in on this?" "Oh, it's nothing to me," I said, and shrugged. "You can build it with your bare hands for all of me." I merely said that, given his premises, Tiny is logical. "Can't you understand?" he demanded, searching my face. "Damn it, can't you understand either?" "I understand what I understand." "Can't you understand?" he demanded, and heaved up from the couch. And the instant he was on his feet, from the slight sway of his posture, I knew he had been drinking. He stepped to me and seized my lapel and shook me a little, fixing his eyes upon my face, now close to him. I could see that they were bloodshot. And saying, "Can't you understand either? I'm building that place, the best in the country, the best in the world, and a bugger like Tiny is not going to mess with it. And I'm going to call it the Willie Stark Hospital. And it will be there a long time after I'm dead and gone, and you are dead and gone, and all those sons of bitches are dead and gone. And anybody, no matter if he hasn't got a dime, can go there and will vote for you," I said. "I'll be dead," he said, "and you'll be dead. And I don't care whether he votes for me or not. He can go in there and bless your name," I said. "Damn it," he shook me hard, crumpling my lapel in his big hand. "You stand there grinning like that. Get that grin off your face. Get it off or I'll..." "Listen," I said. "I'm not any of your scum, and I'm still grinning when I please." "Jack. Hell, Jack, you don't know. You know I don't mean that. It's just you stand there and grin. Damn it, can't you understand? Can't you?" He held the lapel and thrust his big face at me, his eyes gouging into mine, saying, Can't you see I'm not going to let those bastards muck with it? The Willie Stark Hospital, can't you see? And I'm going to get me the best damn man there is to run it. Yes, sir, the best there is. Yes, sir, up in New York, they told me to get him. He was the man. And Jack, you... Yeah? I asked. You're gonna get him. I disengaged from his grasp on my lapel, straightened it, and dropped into a chair. Get who? I asked. Dr. Stanton, he said. Dr. Adam Stanton. I almost bounced right out of my chair. The ash off my cigarette fell down my shirt front. How long have you been having these symptoms? I asked. You been seeing any pink elephants? You get Stanton, he said. You were hearing voices, I said. You get him, he repeated dourly. Boss, I said, Adam is an old pal of mine. I know him like a brother, and I know he hates your guts. I'm not asking him to love me. I'm asking him to run my hospital. I'm not asking anybody to love me, not even you. So this is a fateful choice made in the novel, both for Jack and for Willie. Jack ends up revealing to Adam that his father was involved in a scandal. He reveals that to Adam, and Adam agrees to work for the governor. And Adam eventually murders the governor.
Again, if we haven't convinced you yet, you guys have to check out this book. It's old enough that you can find good old hardcover copies for just a few dollars. And if you're really an absolute, illiterate fool, I'm sure there's a good enough audiobook somewhere around. But anyway, I don't know how much more I have to add, especially after such a powerful reading. But Bagby, before we wrap this up, do you have anything you wanna plug of yours?
Yeah, I'm working on my latest audiobook. When that drops, I'll be sure to make it public so that everyone knows where to get it. It's a book on John C. Calhoun, so another Southerner. I'm gradually adding content to the YouTube page. I'm probably going to try to record something else before I turn in tonight. So there may be a new recording on there soon. I've got something all picked out. But not much else. I do have a Telegram channel. I don't know. Did you post a link to that?
If you give me just a few seconds, I can.
Oh, that'd be awesome.
I am. Oh, sorry. Carry on, Bagby.
I'm still learning how to do these things.
No, I will admit I'm also not exactly the most. I'm sure as everyone who's watched one of my streams knows by now, I'm not exactly the most. I guess the most technologically advanced. It'll take me a little bit. I will add the link to Bagby's Telegram in the description. I don't have it off the top of my head. One thing I will say, I don't know if this is a faux pas to say it, but this year, independently, both Bagby and I will be appearing on, at Millennial Woes, end of the year Millennial streams. I don't know what either of us are going to talk about yet, but you'll be able to hear both of us there. So if you want more content from us, be sure to check those out. I'm sure it'll be, at least one good discussion between the two of us. This show will obviously be available on YouTube. It will also be up as a podcast on Apple and Spotify. And the way that this works is that the most recent 10 episodes are always available on Apple, Spotify, anywhere you listen to podcasts. But after they fall out of that top 10, they do go behind a paywall at my Substack. And I realize it's not a huge thing, but it's a little bit of weight for me to subsidize the cost of the show. I do enjoy it, but as we get into more, I guess, like esoteric topics, Susan gets less and less happy with me. And so it's a good way for me to kind of insulate myself from that. But again, like I said, if I haven't convinced you yet, read this book. It's good. It'll make you a better man or woman, I guess, because there are women who listen to this show. And anyway, guys, keep your head up. The light can't last forever. Good night.